WDBM East Lansing.
89 FM. The Impact.
You're listening to Impact Exposure.
Exposure gives a voice to our community and provides a forum for discussing the relevant issues of today. Broadcasting from the campus of Michigan State University, this is
Impact Exposure.
Although once a prisoner, today many call him a hero, Nelson Mandela, a man who served as President of South Africa from 1994 to 1999 and helped break the apartheid in the country. As he is ill for the past month, we take time today to remember the man. I spoke with history professor at Michigan State, Peter Alegi, about the country led by a man named Nelson Mandela. So first off, who is this Nelson Mandela, and why is he so prominent in South Africa?
Well, Nelson Mandela is often equated with the history of South Africa, particularly modern South Africa. And who is Nelson Mandela? Well, he's arguably one of the most important people of the 20th century, and he has survived into the 21st. He just turned 95 a few days ago. And, you know, in many ways, his life has been described as, you know, the classic hero's journey, a kind of almost like a quest narrative. He grew up, was born in the deep rural areas of the Transkei in the Eastern Cape, the year that thousands of people died of the influenza pandemic in South Africa, like many other places around the world. That was July 18th, 1918, that Mandela was born in a small rural hamlet at Mvezo. And, you know, he was of a minor royal stock. His father was a chief, and he eventually ended up growing up essentially at the feet of the king of the Tembu, the paramount chief of the Tembu people, one of the main Xhosa-speaking groups of the Eastern Cape. But then he became a lawyer, a practicing lawyer, one of the very first Africans to have a law firm in Johannesburg at a time of deep racism on the part of the white minority. He became a revolutionary, of course, but he was also a husband. And we probably got to know him internationally because he was a prisoner, a political prisoner for nearly 30 years. Mm-hmm. And, you know, maybe the younger generations remember him mostly as a president of a democratic South Africa.
Mm-hmm. And why was he a prisoner, for those who don't know?
Well, Nelson Mandela spent most of his life fighting for freedom and justice in South Africa. He grew up in a country that was segregationist, a country ruled by less than 20% of the people. That was the white minority of both Dutch descent, but also of English-speaking stock. And this minority created a system of laws that essentially oppressed the the black majority through these racist laws. And in 1948, these laws became even harsher under the system known as apartheid, which is an Afrikaans word. Afrikaans is a local language derived from Old Dutch of the majority of whites in South Africa. It means apartness. Complete separation between people of different skin pigmentation, an extremely tyrannical and oppressive system. And remember, this is after World War II that apartheid comes into place. You know, a massive global war has been fought against totalitarianism for freedom and democracy, and the world seems to be going in that direction, and South Africa takes the opposite tack and moves towards a more rigid racist system. And Mandela found himself square in the middle of this incredible moment. And he was part of a huge group of black political activists. Many of them were part of the African National Congress, the leading liberation movement in South Africa. And he fought against injustice for freedom and equality in South Africa. And he paid extremely dearly for his commitment.
And when he came out of jail, he was still a prominent political figure. How does that happen where he was, you know, as some people call the world's most famous prisoner? How do you become the world's most famous prisoner, and why were they so drawn to him?
That's a really good question. I think the reason people were drawn to him, both in South Africa and internationally, had to do with how much he did prior to going to prison. Right? He had already gained incredible standing as a man of valor, a man of courage, a man of principle, willing to stand up in the most difficult moments. Let me give you an example. Right? In 1948, apartheid begins, extending the segregation that already existed and making it harsher and more complete. And Nelson Mandela basically became the leader of the black political movements that were taking place at the time. In 1952, the ANC, the African National Congress, together with some other allies like the Indian Congress in South Africa, launched a defiance campaign, which was similar to what you saw with the civil rights movement in the United States, whereby activists started violating the segregationist laws in order to prove their injustice. And so, for example, in 1952, during the Defiance Campaign, thousands of black South Africans sat in white-only sections of buses, or sat in on the whites-only benches in parks, used whites-only toilets, and so on and so forth, essentially saying, we're not going to tolerate these racist laws. And Mandela he was the leader of the Defiance Campaign. As a result, he was arrested numerous times, and he grew in stature. He was also a very prominent activist when the blueprint of the liberation struggle, called the Freedom Charter, a kind of almost a constitution in the making for a new democratic South Africa, was adopted in 1955. And he was put on trial, and he was on trial for 6 years as a result of his role in coagulating this alliance of people arguing for one person, one vote in South Africa. He was acquitted in that trial, and soon thereafter, of course, he decided that a different kind of action was necessary. He had been a nonviolent activist up until about 1960, but following a massacre of 69 civilians in March of 1960 at a place called Sharpeville, just south of Johannesburg, innocent civilians shot, many of them in the back, by the police. They were protesting particularly pass laws, which in South Africa were laws that required all black people to carry a document that had to be produced if the authorities requested it. And if your pass, so to speak, was not in order, they could arrest you. And normal people, ordinary people who had been home and maybe left their house without their jacket would be criminalized, would be thrown in prison alongside murderers and rapists and ordinary criminals. And so millions of people were suffering under this terrible system. And what did Mandela say when the police slaughtered these people at Sharpeville in March of 1960? He said the following, and I quote, "Nonviolence was a tactic that should be abandoned when it no longer worked." So while he adopted Gandhian tactics, for him, it wasn't the end-all and be-all, pacifism or nonviolence or civil disobedience. It was a tactic. And once the police started shooting men, women, and children who were unarmed, and many of them in the back, to him it meant that, as he said, referring to a Tswana language proverb in his autobiography, the attacks of the wild beast cannot be averted with only bare hands. You need to take up arms. And so Mandela became the first military commander of the Spear of the Nation, Umkhonto we Sizwe. He became an armed guerrilla. He became a terrorist, in fact, for the South African state. And not many people know this, but the State Department of the United States government still had Nelson Mandela on the terrorist list as late as 2008.
Past his presidency.
Well past his well into his retirement. He was still officially a terrorist. And I think that's important because it says a lot about Mandela's standing both within South Africa and internationally. And when he was caught in August of 1962, he was arrested by the South African police. Everyone thought this is the end of Mandela. They're going to put him on trial, they're going to have a sham trial, and they're going to hang him because he is a dangerous prisoner, dangerous political activist, and now he's a prisoner, and the South African government probably wants to get rid of him. And a huge campaign worldwide was started to save his life. And it was not just Mandela, there were several others on trial as well. Well, the trial started in 1963. Lots of foreign reporters were there. Microphones were not allowed, no taping devices of any kind, and yet a BBC reporter managed to sneak in a tape recorder, and we do have audio of one of the most amazing political speeches of the 20th century, and that was Mandela's famous statement from the dock. He didn't testify because basically Mandela and the other people who were charged felt that this was going to be, a foregone conclusion, that they were going to be found guilty by the apartheid state. And he gave this amazing speech, dozens and dozens of pages long, and he closes with this incredible statement. This is, I think, the most important statement Mandela made before he was released from prison. Here's what he said, with lots and lots of people in the gallery. All the attorneys are staring intently, the judges as well. And here's what Mandela says. During my lifetime, I have dedicated myself to the struggle of the African people. I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But, if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die.
Wow. That's Nelson Mandela.
That's Nelson Mandela. He says, I was sure I was going to be sentenced to death.
But he wasn't.
And he said, but he had this kind of bravery that people admired and still do to this day.
Right. And then in 1994, he was elected president. Now, how did South Africans respond to his elected president?
Well, coming out of 27 and a half years in prison.
I guess he was in a think tank, so they really thought he knew what he was doing.
He had a long time to think about many of the issues that were facing South Africa by 1990, and there was huge celebrations everywhere, of course. I mean, by then he was the most famous political prisoner in the world, so it was a fantastic celebration. I remember we were in college. I was in college at the time, and with my college classmates, we had a huge party to celebrate Mandela's release, but we, like many South Africans, didn't know what was coming. I mean, after all, he had just been released from prison. It wasn't as if democracy had suddenly dawned, right? And Mandela had already had secret talks with the South African regime while in prison, where they had hammered out some general points of agreement that laid the groundwork for what some have called the negotiated revolution. And so South Africans celebrated, but they also looked up to Mandela and that core of mostly ANC leaders who were talking to the apartheid regime, hoping that they would get a free and democratic South Africa very soon. Now, it took about 4 years between Mandela's release and the first democratic elections, and it was a difficult time. I was in South Africa in 1993 when, Mandela was called on a very difficult evening when basically the number 2 person in the ANC and what the person many people felt was going to be the successor of Mandela was assassinated in his driveway by 2 white supremacists. His name was Chris Hani, a really impressive individual and wonderful human being. And he was gunned down as he picked up his Saturday newspaper on Easter Saturday. And we felt that the country was on the brink of a racial bloodbath. And nobody really knew what to do. I walked out of the small house where I was staying with people who I worked with, and there were military vehicles on the streets, hardly any people walking on the street, which is very unusual in a South African city. I was in Cape Town at the time. And that evening at about 8 p.m., Mandela came on the television. Not the president of South Africa, who at the time was F.W. de Klerk, who Mandela would share the Nobel Peace Prize with a few months later, but Mandela. Mandela came on the television, and the 8 o'clock news, he came and he gave an incredibly powerful speech, which essentially said to people, cool it, right? This is a terrible thing that has happened, but these 2 assassins are going to be dealt with by the justice system, and we have a greater goal that we need to reach. And that goal, of course, was the elections. And we can't have a civil war now when the prize is within reach. And, you really saw that evening how Mandela was already essentially the president. But it would take several more months before a date would be set. But we all knew who was really running the country by that time, and it was already Mandela. Mandela.
And Mandela had another way of getting things done is he went to athletics. He looked into athletics to try to unite a country. How did he do that? And you studied it. I mean, you're an expert in this topic. So how exactly did Mandela take athletics to unite South Africa?
That's a really interesting question that goes right to the heart, really, of what I love to do, which is look at the social and political history
Your eyes
of
kind of
sport
brightened up.
in South Africa, right? I think it starts with his personal love of sports. He opens his autobiography, which, if listeners out there haven't read it, pick it up, Long Walk to Freedom, the autobiography of Nelson Mandela, one of the greatest books ever written. He describes his childhood in terms of his stick fighting as a youth. This is a very popular sport still today in the rural areas of South Africa because boys are expected to herd cattle. And that's how you spend a good chunk of your day is herding your father or your male relative's cattle. And you have these great fencing matches, essentially, with the other boys. And you prove your manhood, you entertain yourself. And sometimes it gets very competitive, and you might have these stick fighting competitions against neighboring villages. And the better you are, the greater your social standing and your visibility. So he had this deep passion for sport as a very young kid. When he moved to the city, particularly to Johannesburg, he became an amateur boxer. And so while he was pursuing his political activism and he was studying law and eventually also opened a law firm with his friend Oliver Tambo, he went in the evenings and sparred at this very famous gym in what is today Soweto, the big black town outside of main then white Johannesburg. And so he was never a professional prize fighter, but he was a very good heavyweight amateur boxer. In school, he also ran track. He did play soccer, although in his autobiography he says he was a terrible player. So we'll take his word for it. And also when he was in prison, he was not allowed to play sports because he was in a particular section of Robben Island prison, the kind of South African Alcatraz for political prisoners. The authorities did not allow the important prisoners like Mandela and several of his comrades to play sports. He was eventually allowed in the late 70s to play tennis, which he played in the courtyard outside his cell. But the other prisoners on Robben Island in what was called the general population, they were eventually allowed to play soccer, and they even had prison Olympics. But Mandela was never allowed. So I think he had this deep love for sports, but also an understanding of how powerful it could be. Mm-hmm. And eventually, when he became president, he saw that rugby, which was the sport of the white minority, was about to host the World Cup. And he thought this is a great opportunity to get recalcitrant whites, these more conservative whites who are not fully on board with the transition from apartheid to democracy, to really embrace what is going on in South Africa. Because South Africa, as Mandela liked to say, belongs to all who live in it, black and white. And so he understood the value of sport culturally, but he also remembered that during the 1960s and 70s and into the 80s, white South Africa had been excluded from the Olympics. They had been excluded from the Soccer World Cup. This was part of the sport boycott. And so he knew that there was political value within sport. And he also knew that sports stars were revered in South African societies like they are in ours. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, they're much more important and valuable than politicians, right? And so he embraced the springbok, the gazelle, the South African gazelle, as the symbol of the white rugby team at the World Cup in 1995, which is closely associated with apartheid. Mm-hmm. And in the movie Invictus, Clint Eastwood's movie Invictus, starring Matt Damon and Morgan Freeman as Mandela, there's a scene where Mandela intervenes in a meeting where they're getting rid of the springbok mm-hmm. emblem because it's a horrible memory of the apartheid past, and Mandela convinces those officials to keep it as a way to embrace more conservative whites and say, we're with you. We will retain this symbol that's important to you because we want you to be part of a racially united and reconciled South Africa. And this is a really important moment, of course, in the movie, but also in the real story, because those Springboks only had one player of color, Chester Williams. Everyone else was white. Mm-hmm. And so this was a really generous act on the part of Mandela. And South Africa ended up winning the World Cup, right? And so, like sports tend to do, they convert these kinds of narratives into something almost magical. And so for a short while, South Africa really was united across racial lines, and Mandela had a lot to do with that.
Well, my last question is, what can we learn from Nelson Mandela? If you could say one thing that people can take away from this man that some call hero, some call president, others call Nelson Mandela, what is it?
I was just listening to an interview with his archivist, Vern Harris, who is a good friend of mine, and Vern said that the word that comes up in his mind when he was posed a very similar question was endurance.
Endurance.
And I like that because endurance gives me the sense of a person who was always thinking in the long term, who was able to see beyond himself. We think of political leaders in a very cynical way these days. They're only in it for their own personal power, or worse, for their enrichment. We tend to view politicians and political leaders in a very negative way, and I think there's some basis for that. But I think a lot of what happens in politics today is very short-term oriented and driven by short-term goals. Mandela, at various points in his life, could have made different choices. For example, when he entered into secret talks with the apartheid government, the regime offered him to be released if he told the ANC to end the armed struggle against apartheid. So he could have gotten a degree of freedom, shall we say, for relinquishing this struggle. He said, no, I'd rather remain in prison because at this point, if we give up our arms, we'll still be living in a deeply racist and unequal society, right? His thinking was long-term. One person, one vote. South Africa belongs to all who live in it. And he endured after he had already endured 2 decades in prison. He had fought tuberculosis. Here he's offered the carrot of walking out of prison, sort of a free man, and he turns it down. Or when F.W. de Klerk reveals to the world that he's going to release Mandela on February 2nd, 1990, he makes this incredible announcement, stunning everybody pretty much. And Mandela says, oh no, but I can't leave prison yet. Says we have to prepare properly for this. He has spent 27 and a half years in prison, and he waits 9 more days before he walks out of prison at Victor Verster prison. So endurance, a man who always had, I think, the ultimate goal in mind and paid dearly for pursuit of that. And of course, he endured great pain, personal pain. He had no family life. He spent very little time with his children and with his 2 wives. And I think that's why he has enjoyed being a grandfather in his retirement so much. He spends, he has spent until he got very sick recently, almost all his free time with his grandchildren and great-grandchildren and his other relatives because he, was not able to give to his family. So endurance is what comes to mind.
Well, thank you very much. That's Peter talking about Nelson Endurance Mandela. Thank you.
Thank you.